How does someone's beliefs about their own future wealth affect their financial decisions?
Yeah, so this is in related research with Jennifer Trueblood also. And so what we look at here in this project is ways that our beliefs about future wealth influence our risk-taking decisions in particular. And so often when people think about decisions to take on risk, let's say to invest in the stock market, let's say, the main question is, well, what do people think about what do people think the stock market return is going to be in the future, and what is their risk tolerance, right? Those are sort of the two main factors. And so what we look at in this research is the idea that one very salient reference point for people is a question of what are my own beliefs going to be in the future. Sorry, not one of my own beliefs. What is my own expectation of what my returns would be for my financial portfolio, in some sense, like in the absence of any investments. So if I think, I'm not going to change jobs, I'm not going to have any major life events, but I'm expecting that my assets will increase by a certain amount over the next year, just from sort of not really doing anything. Then what happens is that might change the way that I view the different options in terms of what I think of as a safe investment and what I think of as a risky investment. And so in particular, we could think about investing in the stock market or investing in, let's say, a bond that's going to earn 2%. And we can think about that trade-off as being, one is a safe return. We know for sure that we're going to have a small positive return, and one is risky. So, stock market could go up by 10%. It could, I guess, could go down by 10%. But what happens when we think about our expectation of future wealth as a reference point is that now shifts the belief about the safe option, so that if I have this baseline belief that my wealth is going to outperform the safe option, that means that safe option now becomes a guaranteed loss. And so in this paper, what we think about is the perspective of thinking like a prospect theory framework, where what we evaluate are outcomes as a function of like, what is the change relative to a reference point, right? And so rather than thinking about the expectation of the reference point being zero, we think about this reference point being your baseline belief about future wealth.
Wow.
And so in the paper, what we do is we look at comparisons where we basically ask people, again, sort of these similar scenarios, to imagine these different situations of assets and debt, and to state their beliefs about the future and how and their predictions for the future, as well as how they would make various investment decisions. And we then look at this using different model comparisons. And what we find is that the outcome, that people's choices are better explained by a model that incorporates essentially this expectation of future wealth as a reference point. And in particular, I think the interesting piece here is that the model that outperforms has both this risk parameter, so how much do I care about this sort of volatility element, but it also incorporates this loss aversion parameter. So how much do I care about the idea of losing money in this sort of guaranteed state? And so that's what we find there in terms of these predictions.
That's crazy. So people set a reference point, and then they still care about volatility, but they also care about a loss relative to the reference point. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Where does the reference point come from?
Where do these beliefs come from?
Yeah.
Well, so I think there's sort of an age-old question of where do reference points come from. So that question is as old as the idea of reference points. And so rather than thinking about it as the status quo, there are these beliefs. So people tend to have optimistic beliefs about the future, and that's pretty consistent. And so we started working on this project, I don't remember, maybe in like 2018, something like that. And so we wanted to look at what happens when there's variation in these beliefs. So people always think that their money is going to go up. That's basically always what people think. And so then there's, everything was just sort of going up. then we came across COVID, and all of a sudden we had some variation in beliefs. And
Hmm.
so that was, I think, from the perspective of many researchers, this is sort of this, this variation that ends up being helpful for answering certain research questions. And so there we're able to look at what happens when people actually do have varied beliefs.
Hmm.
And so in some of the data that we look at, we have people's beliefs. So this was a study that was conducted, I think, around May of 2020. So sort of right in the middle of the thick of things around COVID. And here we asked people, so this is now no longer random variation. This is now people just thinking about their own lives. But we asked people to make predictions about their own future states, or sort of how they expected their own sort of steady state to perform. We also asked people about their stock market expectations, and we asked people about how they would allocate funds between a safe bond and a sort of the stock market. And what we find is that after accounting for beliefs about the stock market, which should, of course, influence this decision, what we find is that we find a split where the bond in this hypothetical scenario was returning 2%. And so for people who believe at baseline that their wealth will increase by more than 2% over the next year, these are people who are going to be much more likely to invest in the stock market. These are people who are not viewing it as the loss.
Hmm.
So how can people use this information to make better financial decisions?
So, in some sense, this is more descriptive than it is prescriptive. So here, as in the case of conspicuous consumption, like if you really care about what other people think, then that's something that should enter into your preference function, and there's not necessarily a wrong decision. In this case, the major concern comes from biased beliefs. So if what you care about are losses relative to this expectation of the future outcome as a reference point, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It becomes a problem when you're wrong about what the future is going to hold. And so people tend to be optimistic. There's also interesting work on this expense prediction bias expense neglect. Expense prediction bias is something else that I think maybe we'll talk about later, but where people tend to sort of underestimate how much their expenses will grow in the future, and this leads people to think that they'll have more slack.
Wow.
But so there are different ways that these beliefs tend to be biased. We actually don't find a ton of evidence for biases in the beliefs in our own data. So we ask people these predictions about the future, and then we compare people's beliefs to data from the PSID, from the Panel Study of Income Dynamics over the same period. We actually don't find wildly biased beliefs, although they are optimistic. But the challenge really comes in making sure that the beliefs that people are basing their preferences off of are realistic.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Super interesting.